Okay, today I wanted to talk about just a good intro move or aspect that I've seen a few stories do, which I'll just call engaging the audience. And so far, this has been done a number of different ways. It technically can be done as many ways as you want, but just a way that it's done very effectively is using villain. So I've been watching a band of brothers, and actually, let me switch to a new tab. There we go. Band of Brothers. And in episode 1 of this story, we have a fellow that kind of acts as a very good way of pulling the audience in for a story, basically. We have Major, or Captain, I suppose he's promoted throughout it, but he's Captain Sobel. He is the commanding officer for the troops in Georgia. And basically, he is introduced for basically being a bully, more or less. He finds, the smallest infraction or mistake or makes one up, basically, and then forces the men to go on like 3 to 12 mile hikes, basically. 3 miles hikes is up a mountain, 12-mile hikes is with full gear, basically. So he's just finding all kinds of fun things to do and all excuses to make the men run as much as possible, smoke them, and all that, basically. So the reason why I just kind of wanted to highlight this is because I thought this is a good way. Anytime you start a story off, you always usually have to ask the question of why does somebody like my main character? Or does it, or I guess even before then you ask, is that necessary? But usually it is. Usually you want your characters to be liked. So we're going to ask, why does the audience like your character? Which more specifically is, why does the audience care? Why do they care what happens? They care what happens because they like somebody. And there's a number of different reasons why somebody can do this, but the main one, or not a main one, I should just say a popular one to do that is done very effectively in a number of stories is what you do is you can create a villain, basically. So for the first episode, and this kind of covers, I'm just going to talk about kind of episode 1. Let's do it here. Episode 1 of the Band of Brothers story. Kurahi. Yeah, Kurahi. And basically, I think that's named after the mountain that they have to hike up and down, basically. It's 3 miles up and then 3 miles down. We'll get some shading over here and something like that. There we go. Oops. I didn't do a great job. But you know what? It's a mountain. Therefore it is. But basically what it allows you to do is, if you start off this story, because basically the whole story is about the army in training, basically. So they're training. So they're not fighting. So basically training, this means no fighting. This means no Germans. This means no explosions. This means no people dying in combat, really. Basically, all of this is kind of technically taking, quote unquote, the boring parts, all this prep work. Basically, all of this is prep work, more or less. They're just training for the army. So it's basically taking this way and trying to answer the question, how to make the audience care. Basically, why does the audience care about training? Why does the audience care about running up a mountain and then back down? Why does the audience care about any of this? Also, how do we get the audience to care about our main characters that we've just introduced all of them? Like, we've just thrown the audience in and said, here's a bunch of people. We now have to make the audience care about them. And you want the audience to care about it. Well, I guess the question is, if you want your audience to care about them, because there may be good reasons why you want them not to. There are some reasons for it, and some stories do a pretty good job of it. Usually it's horror stories, because if you want to kill all the main characters, you don't really want the audience to be sad. You don't want it to be tragedy. So you try and make it so the audience can enjoy watching people get massacred, and usually it's because the audience are terrible, or the main characters are terrible. But basically what you can do is you can do it by either having a few different ways. You can have them be our characters. They can be funny, cool, interesting, any of the normal reasons of why you might like someone, anything like that. Interesting, And all of these is definitely true and everything like that. But usually, and this is how, you notice this is kind of cliche almost to say at the point with superheroes, but usually the superheroes are, of course, defined by their villains, basically. Their villains are more or less the most interesting part about them, and that's kind of what makes them interesting, basically. So what we have here, we have Captain Sobel, who's basically bullying people and pushing them and continually denying weekend pass. They never get a day off. They're just running miles and miles and miles and miles and miles and miles. And he's just a general ass, basically. Just a complete asshat. And all the troops hate him. He's also, on top of everything like this, he's also incompetent, basically. So, incompetent. So he's not a good commander, basically. And with all this is basically, it's just kind of interesting because more or less the beginning in the first episode is basically chosen to kind of tell it through the eyes of Captain Sobel, and also through the counterpart is this guy named Richard Winters, who's working under him. Richard Winters is the complete opposite, basically. All the men like him. He's a great leader. He's working them. He enjoys pushing them, but also at the same time, he is on the side, and he's constantly in this track record where he finds himself basically carrying out the bullying orders from Captain Sobel. But this is how the writers and kind of story pulls the audience in. Basically what they do is you can take a whole bunch of characters, because remember, this is Band of Brothers, so it's introducing like 20-ish, I don't know, maybe it's 10, 20 characters. It's really hard to make it so you can care about this many characters. But what you do is you have a whole bunch of people, and then you have one guy that everyone hates. This will be Sobel. And everybody hates him, and he is mean to all these guys. And so what you do is you make the audience hate this guy, and then all these guys, and he bullies them, and then everybody likes these guys. That's kind of the simplest form. The TLDR, basically, for this whole thing is like, this is an easy way to do it. It's basically you take a character that nobody likes, and then you have somebody that at least stands up to them in some way, which Winters does. Winters stands up to him and kind of is seen to continually, not quite undercutting, but he's standing up for the men. He's basically standing up for the men. So basically we all like these guys, more or less. Because we hate him. And that's a really good trick to use, because basically then it gets you and endears everyone to all of these characters, because they are, of course, standing up against the bully. So, of course, you want to stand against the bully, and you want to stand for the people who stand up against the bully. And that's kind of the equation from there. And really, that's kind of the simplest aspect, is basically, and that's kind of the interesting thing, is because a lot of the first part of the story is kind of told from the point of view of Sobel, basically. It's from the point of view, basically, of the villain, more or less. And he kind of fulfills the villain role in the first episode, basically. Because in this first episode, there are no Germans. There is no other traditional enemy for this. So basically, how do you make a war movie about fighting the Germans? How do you make that interesting when there are no Germans, basically? And so what you can do is you can have this character play, of course, it's an introductory villain, and I think he comes back in and again in the story later. But basically, you can kind of throw this out there and just use this technique to immediately. And that's the thing, is like, this is not really like a long-term thing. You still have to develop your characters. You still need to develop them. You still need to build on them, make them interesting. I don't know if that has an E or not. Either way. Interesting, characters, basically all this. You still have to do, but it all immediately becomes a lot easier if you can at least engage the audience and make them interested in your story. Because remember, the first part of your story is supposed to be the hook, more or less. Because basically you can see it with just about any television show, is that the first episode has a lot of viewers, the second one has less, and then less and less, and it just keeps going down and down and down and down and down and down. But your first episode is probably, and I think everyone kind of understands, is the most important. And it doesn't even have to be an episode. This is kind of how Game of Thrones does it similarly as well, basically, is who do we start off the story with? We, of course, start off with Ned Stark, but basically, who do we have? We have Joffrey and Tyrion. I can't remember if it's an A or no. I think it's no. Joffrey and Tyrion. We know little to nothing about Tyrion, and yet the audience loves him. The reason why is because we hate Joffrey, because, I mean, it's hard not to hate him, basically. And so how are you gonna get the audience to like Tyrion? Because this is the thing, too. He is not just Tyrion, he is Tyrion Lannister. Basically, what you're kind of do is you're trying to go going against the flow of the story, because they're pulling the Lannisters are the bad guys, they're evil, all that and everything like that from there. And basically that's all these characters. This is kind of the role that they play, but they all hate Joffrey so much that the second Tyrion stands up and slaps him in the face, everyone's Team Tyrion, basically. And what that does is it sets up conflict, which is good. You really want conflict to be set up here, of course, because your story is basically going to be built out of conflict. It gives you a site to, you can root for. You can cheer for Tyrion. Cheer for Tyrion, and you can root against Joffrey. And now we have the beginning of the story. Because, of course, ... what does this lead up to? This leads up to the number one question that all your audience needs to be asking, which is, of course, the magical, and wonderful. What happens? What happens next? And if you can get your audience to ask this question, then you've got them, and you get to take them wherever you want to go and lead them into the next step from there. So this one's going to be really short because I think it kind of covers basically everything that I already wanted to and kind of wanted to get from there. So yeah, hope you guys learned something, and I will see you in the next one.